Hi, and welcome to 10-Minute Neuroscience. In this installment, I'll be focusing on the role of the hippocampus in memory. I'll start with an introduction to some of the different types of memory, then I'll focus in on a specific type of memory called declarative memory, which the hippocampus is especially involved in. I'll cover the structure of the hippocampus and surrounding regions, and I'll explain the roles these areas are thought to play in declarative memory. I want to add one caveat to start. What I'll present in this video aligns with what is found in most major neuroscience textbooks, but this is an area of active research, and that research has already begun to layer more complexity onto the view that I'll present here. Still, this introduction will give you a good foundation to understand the general role of the hippocampus in memory and an ability to appreciate the evolving research in this area. Let's start first by talking about the time scale of memories. The briefest form of memory is called sensory memory, and it includes very short-lived sensory traces that last from milliseconds to seconds and help to make our perceptual experience feel smooth and continuous. Next, we have short-term memory, which is a form of memory that typically lasts on the order of seconds unless we actively keep the information in mind, like by repeating it or focusing on it. If we do, it increases the chances of it being stabilized into longer-lasting forms of memory. Long-term memories are more durable and can last for days to years or even the rest of our lives. For example, I don't think I'll ever forget the address of my childhood home. That would be a long-term memory. There are also thought to be different kinds of memory that serve different functions, and one of the most common distinctions is between declarative and non-declarative memory. Declarative memory is sometimes called explicit memory, and it refers to memories we can consciously access and describe. This includes episodic memory, which involves events from our own lives, like what you did yesterday, or semantic memory, which consists of facts and general knowledge, like knowing what a neuron is. Declarative memory includes information we can declare to someone else. Non-declarative memory, on the other hand, which is also known as implicit memory, refers to memories that influence behavior without needing to be consciously recalled. These are memories we use without deliberately thinking about them, and sometimes without even realizing they're influencing us. One example would be skill and habit learning, where a certain behavior like riding a bicycle or tying your shoes becomes more automatic over time. Non-declarative memories are formed using various parts of the brain, including the basal ganglia, cerebellum, amygdala, sensory areas, and so on, but they're typically less dependent on the hippocampus. For the rest of the video, I'm going to focus primarily on declarative memories, which often involve the hippocampus and nearby regions. The hippocampus is found deep within the temporal lobe. The word hippocampus comes from the Greek hippocampos, hippos meaning horse and campos meaning sea monster. The word eventually came to be used to describe a seahorse, and the hippocampus got its name because when you remove it from the brain, it vaguely resembles a seahorse, as you can see in this image here. And although we often refer to the hippocampus, there really are two hippocampi in your brain, one in each cerebral hemisphere. Despite its relatively small size, the hippocampus plays a central role in forming new declarative memories, but it's generally not as critical for non-declarative memories. One popular hypothesis suggests that the hippocampus helps to link the different parts of an experience into a single memory that can be stored and retrieved later. Any experience you have, for example, has many details associated with it, like what you saw, heard, touched, etc., what emotions you had, where you were, and so on. It might be that a key role of the hippocampus is to rapidly link these different pieces of information together so they can later be recalled as a coherent memory. To do this, the hippocampus could create an index of sorts of what areas of the cerebral cortex were activated during the original experience. This is a type of indexing that allows the brain to later reconstruct the entire event by reactivating all the areas of the cortex that were activated during the original experience. In this way, the hippocampus is thought to play critical roles in both the formation and recall of declarative memories, at least for a time being, because as we'll see, eventually the cortex is thought to take over the reactivation that occurs in recall to some degree, although this is an area neuroscientists are still investigating. Before we get deeper into that, let's discuss some more anatomy. The hippocampal system involved in memory formation is made up of several distinct subregions that contribute differently to memory processing. We can call the hippocampus and these subregions together the hippocampal formation, and you can see a close-up of the hippocampal formation here. The rest of the hippocampal formation, besides the hippocampus, is often defined as consisting of a region called the dentate gyrus and another called the subiculum. In addition to being compared to a seahorse, the hippocampus has also been compared to the horns of the ancient Egyptian god Amun, and thus has been called Amun's horn or cornu ammonis. Because of this, the hippocampus has been subdivided anatomically into 4 regions designated CA1 through CA4, with the CA standing for cornu ammonis. Many texts actually consider CA4 to be part of the dentate gyrus, and I'm going to follow that convention, so I won't be discussing CA4 individually. Instead, I'll just discuss the role of the dentate gyrus overall. Information enters the hippocampal formation mainly through an adjacent area called the entorhinal cortex, which serves as a primary interface between the hippocampus and much of the rest of the cerebral cortex. The entorhinal cortex receives extensive projections from the cerebral cortex, and these projections carry information about the different components of an experience, like what you see, how you feel, etc. The entorhinal cortex funnels these separate streams of information to the hippocampal formation so they can be linked together in a single memory. The major pathway from the entorhinal cortex to the hippocampal formation is the perforant pathway, which carries information to the dentate gyrus and other parts of the hippocampal formation. The dentate gyrus is thus a main site of initial processing in the hippocampal formation. It's thought, for example, to play a critical role in sorting information based on shared characteristics, a process sometimes called pattern separation. For instance, you probably had dinner several times this week, maybe not in the same location every time, maybe not with the same people each time, and maybe you ate different foods. So these are distinct events, and your brain needs to store the memories of these events separately so they don't interfere with one another. The dentate gyrus may help to create a neural representation that makes each experience distinct enough to be retrievable later as its own memory. After the incoming information has been given a distinct neural code in the dentate gyrus, information flows along what's known as the mossy fiber pathway into the CA regions of the hippocampus. Specifically, most of the information enters region CA3, which is thought to be involved in taking the different elements of an experience, where you were, who you were with, what was happening, etc., each of which ultimately reflects activity originating in different areas of the cortex, and linking those patterns of neural activity together into a single memory trace. This may help to create a kind of map of the cortical activity that define the experience, so that later, during retrieval, a cue can help reactivate that same distributed pattern of activity in the cortex and allow the memory to be recalled as a single event. I should add that CA3 also receives direct input from the entorhinal cortex, so it's integrating multiple streams of information as it's building a memory representation. Information then flows to CA1 primarily through a major pathway called the Schaffer collaterals. This chain of connections, by the way, from the entorhinal cortex to the dentate gyrus to CA3 to CA1 is often called the trisynaptic circuit. CA1 also, however, receives input directly from the entorhinal cortex. This places CA1 in a position to compare the memory trace constructed in CA3 with other incoming sensory information, making it well suited to detect mismatches between stored representations and incoming information, and helping to update memories when necessary. The complete role of CA1 is still being researched, but in general it seems to integrate input from CA3 with other input from the entorhinal cortex, helping to refine the output of the hippocampus. After CA1 refines the information, it sends the output primarily to the subiculum, a main output area of the hippocampal formation. The subiculum routes the information back to the entorhinal cortex, which conveys it to widespread areas of the cerebral cortex. Sending the output back to the cortex helps the brain replay the pattern of activity that made up the experience. That replay supports recall, and it also helps the cerebral cortex gradually build a more stable long-term version of the memory, which we'll come back to soon. The subiculum also projects to various other brain regions, which might allow memories to influence motivation, behavior, decision-making, and emotion, among other things. So CA1 provides refined hippocampal output to the subiculum, but the subiculum serves as the main distribution hub that determines where the output goes and how it interacts with the rest of the brain. So this is how the hippocampus participates in the formation of memories, but it also plays a critical role during recall. When you try to remember a past event, for example, recall is often triggered by only a partial cue, a word, a smell, a place, etc. Within the hippocampus, the CA3 region is thought to be especially important for initiating recall, using that partial cue to reactivate its stored memory pattern. The reconstructed memory signal then flows to CA1, which helps refine and organize the recalled information. Then output from CA1 is routed through the subiculum, which helps send the reactivation signal back to the cortex. Then the same regions of the cortex that originally encoded the sights, sounds, meanings, and emotions of an experience are reactivated. In this way, recall is not like retrieving a fixed recording, but more like reconstructing an event. But with time, memory recall often seems to depend less on the hippocampus and more on the cerebral cortex. So let's look at why that might be the case. As I've mentioned, in the early period after an experience, the hippocampus acts somewhat like an index, binding together the distributed regions of the cortex that represent different aspects of the experience. During this early phase, recalling the memory is thought to depend heavily on hippocampal activity, because the cortex still relies on the hippocampus to reactivate the full pattern of cortical activity. Over time, however, repeated reactivation of these hippocampal and cortical networks leads to the strengthening of connections within the cortex itself. In other words, the cortical neurons that were repeatedly activated together gradually become more directly and strongly linked to one another. As a result, memories may become less dependent on the hippocampus and more supported by networks distributed throughout the cerebral cortex. This helps explain the observation that very old memories can sometimes survive hippocampal damage better than recent ones. Over time, the cortex has effectively learned the memory well enough to reconstruct it with less help from the hippocampus. And thus, the stable storage site for long-term memories is typically distributed throughout the cortex and not within the hippocampus itself. Although, I should point out that there is debate about whether some declarative memories, especially episodic memories, ever become fully independent of the hippocampus. In short, our understanding of long-term memory is still evolving and more research is needed to fully understand the mechanisms and locations of memory storage. At the cellular level, one of the key mechanisms supporting the process of memory consolidation both in the hippocampus and throughout the rest of the brain is synaptic plasticity, particularly a process known as long-term potentiation, or LTP. LTP refers to a long-lasting increase in synaptic strength that occurs when neurons are repeatedly activated together. If you're interested in the mechanisms underlying LTP, I cover the best understood mechanism of LTP in the video linked above. Well, I hope you found this introduction helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them.